Welcome to the Plausible Case. The world you see is only part of the story. Silence hides patterns. Choices are tracked. Watch closely. Some stories don't end, they unfold.
On the same Tuesday in March, 3 people quit their jobs without warning. Not 3 people at the same company, 3 people at 3 different companies in 3 different cities, working in 3 different industries. They cleared their desks, they deleted their personal files, they didn't call their families, they didn't post anything online. By Friday, 2 of them had accepted positions at firms that didn't appear in any public business registry. The third simply stopped appearing in digital records entirely. The last traceable activity logged under his name was a single file access at 8:42 p.m. on a Thursday evening. After that, nothing, as if he had decided to stop existing. It would have stayed invisible, one of those disappearances that hides in plain sight because nothing technically went wrong, except that one of the 3 was my brother. My name is Mara Ellison. I'm an investigative journalist, or I was. I covered labor policy, corporate compliance, the dry machinery of how companies restructure, how they protect themselves from liability, how they move people around like variables in an equation. I wrote long articles that maybe 1,000 people read. I was good at finding things that were hidden because no one actively concealed them, but because the language surrounding them was deliberately dense, impenetrable, designed to exhaust rather than to clarify. I understood that kind of language. I thought I was immune to it. I wasn't. Liam worked in logistics analytics, Chicago. He had been with the company for 4 years. He called me on Sunday evenings, usually while cooking. He complained about his manager, he talked about running. He mentioned occasionally that the culture was difficult, that the hours were long, that the word resilience appeared in every internal communication as if it were a full sentence. He did not mention that he was planning to leave. He did not call me on the Sunday before the Tuesday he disappeared. 2 days after he quit, a package arrived at my apartment. No note, no return address, just a manila envelope containing a printed document, 47 pages, stapled in the upper left corner. At the top, in plain type, a title, Protocol Acknowledgement and Continuity Framework, Revision 12.4. Every page carried Liam's digital signature. The first line read, "Participation affirms consent to adaptive realignment in the event of systemic need." I set it on my kitchen table. I made coffee. I told myself it was boilerplate, that corporations write in fog because clarity creates accountability, and accountability creates exposure. I had read hundreds of documents like this. They all sounded slightly sinister if you removed the context. The problem was that as I read further, there was no context to remove. The document didn't reference Liam's company by name. It didn't describe a job function, a benefit structure, a reporting hierarchy. It referenced repeatedly and without definition something called the network, capital N, as though the network were a known entity, a pre-existing thing. It described behavioral expectations during what it called transition events. It required signatories to refrain from discussing the protocol with external observers lacking clearance tier equivalents. There was no logo, no issuing organization, no contact information, only a footer code, a string of numbers and letters, and a date. The date was 4 years before Liam disappeared. He had signed this during onboarding. The system had been waiting for him since his first day. I started calling people. Former colleagues of Liam's whose names I found through LinkedIn. Most didn't answer. A few replied with short messages saying they weren't available. One man called me back within an hour, sounded confused, said he didn't remember signing anything unusual, then said he had to go and didn't pick up again. There was one exception, a woman named Nora. She had left Liam's company 6 months earlier. When I reached her, she paused for a long moment before agreeing to meet. She suggested a cafe in a neighborhood where neither of us lived or worked. She arrived before I did. She was already seated near the back. She told me the protocol wasn't presented as an independent document. It was embedded in a digital compliance bundle during onboarding. Data security policy, code of conduct, mandatory arbitration agreement. The protocol sat between them in the same formatting, using the same neutral legal font. 47 pages of abstraction positioned between documents everyone expected to find. If you scrolled through without reading, it looked like everything else. If you didn't sign it, your system credentials didn't activate. You couldn't log in. You couldn't start work. You signed because not signing meant not working, and you didn't read it because you were starting a new job, and no one reads 47 pages of compliance language on their first day. No one. That's not a failure of character. That's a system that understands human behavior and exploits the predictable parts. Nora had tried to read it. She told me this, quietly, without self-pity. She'd opened the document that first evening after arriving home, still carrying the energy of a first day. But the language defeated her, not because she wasn't intelligent, because the language was constructed to defeat. Dense subordinate clauses, self-referential definitions, conditional permissions nested inside conditional restrictions. She made it to page 9. She clicked agree. 6 months into her job, 5 members of her department were reassigned overnight. No advance notice, no farewell messages. Their Slack histories were archived and made read-only. Their email signatures vanished. HR issued a statement describing the situation as strategic realignment, and when Nora pressed for specifics, where did they go, which department, which floor, she was told only that they had accepted cross-sector mobility opportunities. She didn't know what that meant. No one explained. They just weren't there, she told me. Monday morning, 5 desks empty, new access cards already deactivated. 2 months after Nora herself left the company, she received an automated email from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Continuity Participation Confirmation." The message asked her to confirm her non-participation status within 5 business days and included a link. She ignored it. The emails continued weekly for a month, then stopped. She had kept every one of them. I read them in the car afterward. The sender domain matched nothing in Liam's employment history. The language was the same as the protocol, the same careful neutrality, the same absence of threat, the same administrative reasonableness that made everything it described feel inevitable. Confirming non-participation status, as though the default assumption were participation, as though opting out were the unusual choice requiring formal acknowledgement. The footer code on the emails matched the footer code on Liam's document exactly. I had been investigating for 9 days. I was already somewhere I hadn't expected to be. The footer code on Liam's document was 31 characters. I spent 3 days running it through every search method I knew. No results. I filed public records requests with Illinois state agencies. I contacted the Secretary of State's office. I reached out to federal labor researchers, corporate governance journalists, a former Department of Labor official I'd interviewed twice. Nothing. But one labor attorney, a woman who'd spent 2 decades handling employment disputes, paused when I read her the phrase cross-network coordination during emergent scenarios. She said she'd seen similar language, not that phrase exactly, but close, in at least 6 cases over the past 3 years. Clients who had left jobs quietly, without dispute, without negotiating severance. Clients who had accepted positions at companies whose ownership structures she couldn't fully trace. They weren't distressed, she said. That's what was strange. They were calm, like they'd made a decision they understood. I couldn't always find records of the new employer, but I also couldn't find any legal violation. Whatever these agreements are, they're written by someone who knows how to stay inside the lines. I asked her if she'd seen the protocol specifically. She said she hadn't, but she said something else that I kept returning to for weeks afterward. She said, "Whatever you're looking at, it didn't start with any individual company. The uniformity is too precise." Uniformity. That was the word that changed my investigation. I began collecting employee handbooks, dozens of them, sourced through former employees, legal filings, exit interviews archived in academic labor research. I was looking for something specific, and I found it across companies that competed publicly with one another, across industries that had no obvious connection. The phrase was not identical in every document, but the structure was. The conditional commitments, the language of emergent scenarios, the obligation to prioritize systemic preservation during activation events, the careful, deliberate absence of any clause describing how to exit. In 14 separate employee handbooks from companies across finance, biotech, logistics, and infrastructure, I found language that appeared to originate from the same source, not copied exactly, adapted, translated into each company's internal voice, but underneath the translation, the architecture was the same. I started to think of it less as a contract and more as a protocol in the original sense, a set of agreed-upon rules governing communication between systems. These companies weren't sharing employees informally. They had pre-consented, somewhere above the level of individual HR departments, to a mobility framework that moved people across organizational boundaries without triggering the legal friction that normally makes that impossible. Non-competes, data security restrictions, intellectual property clauses, all of those are designed to keep talent inside one organization and out of competitors. The protocol appeared to exist around those restrictions, preempting them, superseding them, not by breaking them, but by making signatories agree before the conflict ever arose to a higher order set of obligations. You could move an employee from a biotech firm to a logistics consultancy overnight without litigation risk if that employee had already agreed 4 years ago on their first day of work in a document they didn't fully read that they consented to adaptive realignment in the event of systemic need. The question was who decided what constituted systemic need. The question was who set the thresholds. The question was who administered the network. The compliance officer agreed to speak only once, in person, with no recording. He had worked at a multinational consulting firm for 11 years before quietly leaving 18 months earlier. He had found the protocol in internal archives, not his company's HR records, deeper archives. Operations infrastructure. We met in a hotel lobby. He had chosen it. He ordered nothing and kept his coat on. He told me the protocol predated most of the individual companies operating under it. Not in its current form, it had evolved, each revision incorporating language from regulatory shifts, economic crises, major disruptions. Pandemic-era clauses appeared in Revision 9. Cybersecurity incident language entered around Revision 10. The current version, 12.4, contained sections that mapped precisely onto post-2020 supply chain terminology. It's adaptive, he said. That's the point. It absorbs whatever the environment throws at it. It updates. Who updates it? I asked. He looked at me steadily. None of the companies. None of them own it. They implement it. He described the protocol as infrastructure, not a policy, not an agreement between identifiable parties. Infrastructure, like a technical standard that governs interoperability between systems without belonging to any single system. The companies weren't collaborating consciously exactly, they were compliant with something above them that they had opted into at some level of corporate governance that doesn't surface in public filings or press releases. The talent pool, he said, was always the point. High-functioning, mid-level professionals across critical sectors, people with clearance, institutional knowledge, operational capacity. During normal periods, they'd just work. During crises, real crises, systemic crises, they can be redeployed quickly across organizational lines without the usual friction. So, it's a private emergency labor system, I said. He considered this. You could call it that. Who benefits? He put on his gloves. Everyone who's inside it, he said. That's the mechanism. That's what makes it stable. He stood and left without looking back. I sat in that hotel lobby for a long time, watching other people check in with their rolling luggage and their lanyard badges, moving between the ordinary transactions of professional life. I wondered how many of them had signed something they hadn't read. I wondered if the number was smaller than I feared, or larger than I could absorb. I began mapping economic data alongside my research. Unemployment spikes, sector-wide layoffs, the quiet, compressing moments when industries contract and people fall. I tracked what I started to call quiet transitions, the pattern of mid-level professionals who left jobs abruptly, without dispute, and resurfaced at obscure subsidiaries or consultancies with opaque ownership. The correlation was precise, not perfect, but precise enough to be structural. During the 2020 contraction, quiet transitions spiked 43% in sectors covered by protocol-adjacent language. During a regional banking disruption 18 months later, a cluster of 12 finance professionals transitioned within a 72-hour window. The firms they moved to had no websites, no listed leadership, but they were operational. They had office space, they had internal communication infrastructure already in place. Meanwhile, non-signatories in equivalent roles experienced layoffs at the standard market rate, sometimes higher, because when organizations contract, they keep the people who are most interoperable, most redeployable, most continuous. The protocol wasn't just a mobility framework, it was a private safety net, one that existed invisibly, accessible only to people who had already consented to be part of the system. You didn't apply, you didn't negotiate terms, you either signed, on day one, between the data security policy and the arbitration clause, or you didn't. And if you didn't, you faced the market alone. The system didn't punish independence with anything dramatic, no blacklist you could find and challenge, no flag in your record, just the ordinary, explicable exposure that everyone faces when a company restructures. Just the mathematics of who is kept and who is released. And the mathematics, if you knew where to look, were not random. They were a consequence. I tried to contact Liam through every channel I had. His personal phone rang once and routed to a generic voicemail that didn't include his name. His apartment had a new tenant. His LinkedIn profile had updated to list him as Strategic Operations Consultant, Network Affiliated. The company name was a hyperlink that resolved to a domain registered 5 weeks earlier. The domain had no content. The registered address led to a shared workspace with no record of tenancy under that name. He had been absorbed. That is the only word that felt accurate. Not fired, not lost. Absorbed into something that was already there, waiting for him since the day he signed without reading. I sat with the 47 pages for the 100th time. I read them differently now, not as a contract between Liam and a company, as a document describing a system to someone being incorporated into it. The language was not coercive, it never threatened. It framed everything in the vocabulary of stability, resilience, continuity, contribution to macroeconomic integrity during periods of contraction. It made participation sound like wisdom, like the reasonable, clear-eyed thing that practical people chose. Page 32 contained a clause I had underread on previous passes. It described information containment responsibilities extending to immediate relational nodes. A relational node was defined, in the document's own glossary, as any individual with direct emotional or professional proximity to a signatory. I put the document down. I was a relational node. I had been one since before I started investigating. The protocol had already accounted for me 4 years ago when Liam signed. My access to information about the system was already categorized as a containment scenario. My investigation was not a surprise. It was a variable the system had already modeled and assigned a response to. The email I had received, Continuity Confirmation Request, the one with the link I hadn't clicked, was not an error. It was not spam. It was the system acknowledging my proximity and asking, in the most neutral and administrative language possible, whether I intended to remain outside. I had 5 business days to confirm non-participation. I had let that window close. The emails had stopped. I didn't know what that meant. I still don't. I spent 3 nights not sleeping well, which is different from insomnia. Insomnia is an absence. This was a presence, the sense that the document on my kitchen table was not inert, that it was still doing something, that simply by reading it, I had entered a relationship with it that I hadn't chosen and couldn't fully define. I spoke to a behavioral economist who had written about institutional compliance. I didn't tell her what I was investigating specifically. I described the mechanism in general terms, a document embedded in a compliance bundle, signed without full comprehension, containing obligations that activate under specific conditions. She didn't find it surprising. Most large-scale systemic coordination doesn't happen through explicit agreement. It happens through standardized language that enough parties adopt for structural reasons. Each individual company adopts it because it reduces certain kinds of friction. None of them necessarily understands the aggregate effect of everyone adopting it simultaneously. Is that better or worse if no one designed it intentionally? She thought about this for a moment that felt longer than it probably was. If no one designed it, she said slowly, then no one can be held responsible for it, and it will keep evolving because nothing is stopping it from doing so. I went home and looked at the document again. I turned to the final clause, which I had read before but not fully absorbed. It read, "Participation ensures eligibility for continuity protections during systemic contraction." Protections from what exactly? Layoffs? Blacklisting? Economic obsolescence? I had read it initially as a vague incentive, the kind of language contracts use to make obligations sound like benefits. But I read it now against the data I had spent months collecting, and it didn't sound vague anymore. It sounded accurate. During every documented period of systemic contraction, the signatories moved. They didn't fall. They transferred. They were, in the most literal and operational sense, protected, not by a government program or a union or an individual employer, by a network of prearranged interdependencies that activated when conditions met the threshold. And the people outside that network, the non-signatories, the ones who had changed companies before encountering the protocol, or who had worked for firms that hadn't adopted it yet, or who simply refused without understanding what they were refusing, those people faced the market as it was, contracting, indifferent, mathematically arranged against their continuity. The horror of it wasn't that anyone had been coerced. The horror was that the choice had been real, and most people had made it in 30 seconds on their first day of work without knowing it was a choice at all. The drafts accumulated. I sent them to editors. The responses were patient and consistent. The evidence was suggestive but not attributable. There was no named organization to expose, no individual executive to confront, no document signed by a board, no leaked email chain, no whistleblower with a title and a face willing to speak on record.
That was the architecture. There was no center, no head, no single point of origin where accountability could land. Just mirrored language, distributed across competing organizations, normalized through repetition until it became invisible, not because it was hidden, but because it was everywhere. When something is everywhere, it starts to look like background. It starts to look like the way things are. And I began to understand, sitting with my unpublishable drafts and my months of sourced, documented, legally defensible research, that the system had not merely survived my investigation, it had contained it. The information existed. I had it. I simply had no architecture through which to transmit it that the existing architecture had already anticipated and neutralized. There was no center to expose, because exposure requires a target. The protocol had no target. It was the field itself.
The final envelope arrived without warning. No return address. Inside was a single page. Not from the protocol. I knew its typography now, like a familiar handwriting. This page was different. Blank except for one thing. The signature block from the protocol's final page, the lines where a name would go, the date field, the confirmation checkbox. Unsigned. All of it blank. At the bottom, in handwriting I recognized immediately, a slight leftward lean, the way Liam had always written since he was 11 years old, a single sentence. It's not about control. It's about survival. Everyone signs eventually. I read it 4 times. I set it down. I looked out the window for a long time. I thought about what survival means when the alternative isn't death, but exclusion. When the architecture makes independence not impossible, but simply more expensive than most people can afford over time. When the rational choice, the prudent choice, the choice that protects your livelihood and your continuity, is also the choice that makes you part of something you never fully understood and cannot fully see. I thought about Liam cooking on Sunday evenings, complaining about his manager, saying the word resilience appeared in every internal document as if it were a complete sentence. I had heard that as burnout, as the ordinary exhaustion of a person in a demanding job. I had not heard it as a man who had been living for 4 years inside a framework that treated his endurance as a pre-consented resource. He had understood something before he disappeared. He opened the protocol the night before he resigned. After 4 years, something had made him finally read it, and what he found there hadn't stopped him from going. Either it hadn't frightened him enough, or it had clarified something he'd already suspected, and clarification, even of something frightening, can feel like relief. I still don't know which. I'm not sure it matters anymore. 3 weeks after the envelope arrived, my publication announced structural changes, strategic restructuring, individual meetings scheduled with HR. The preliminary documents in my inbox that week contained phrases I had spent 6 months learning to recognize: adaptive realignment, cross-sector opportunity, continuity preservation framework. I read every word. I knew what I was looking for now. I found the clause on page 31 of the accompanying compliance bundle, between the updated data handling policy and the revised arbitration agreement. The language was not identical to Liam's document. It was the same architecture, the same logic, the same quiet, patient, reasonable-sounding obligation dressed in slightly different words, the way each revision had always updated the surface while preserving the structure underneath. I sat in my apartment that evening with the compliance bundle open on my laptop and the 47 pages open on my kitchen table and Liam's handwriting on the blank signature page beside them. And for the first time in 6 months of investigating, I understood something that the investigation itself had obscured. The protocol was not something that happened to exceptional people in exceptional circumstances. It was something that happened to ordinary people during ordinary moments. First days of work, compliance bundles, tablets slid across desks, the ambient friction of starting something new, the cognitive load of 100 small decisions, the entirely reasonable human tendency to trust that a document requiring your signature in order to work is not also quietly incorporating you into something vast. It was designed for that version of every person, the version that hadn't read this yet. When I walk into that HR meeting, I will know what's on the tablet before they slide it across the desk. I will know where the protocol sits in the scroll. I will know exactly what I'm agreeing to if I click the checkbox at the bottom. And I will know something else, something that took me 6 months and one missing brother and one unsigned signature page to understand fully. The system has already accounted for both of my choices. It modeled my resistance before I knew I was resisting. It prepared for my investigation before I opened the envelope. It sent me a message asking whether I intended to remain outside, and when I didn't answer, it updated my file and waited. Whether I sign or refuse, the calculation continues. The protocol absorbs both outcomes. My refusal is not disruption. It is simply the data point labeled non-participation, which the system has been tracking since before I received that first envelope, and which changes nothing in the aggregate functioning of something that has been operating across 14 industries and an unknown number of revision cycles and a workforce of hundreds of thousands of people who scrolled past it on their first days of work. The system was designed for that moment. It was designed for the version of you that hadn't read this yet. I still haven't signed, but the meeting is tomorrow, and when they slide the tablet across the desk, I already know that my answer, whatever it is, has been accounted for. The checkbox will be waiting. It has been waiting for a long time.